Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the Scottish Taskforce for Green and Sustainable Financial Services. We at GEFI are particularly proud to be the secretariat for this task force, having started our advocacy work over 10 years ago in Edinburgh, and are delighted to have now made Scotland our home. As a practitioner-led non-profit, we have grown to become a leading global advocacy body, enabling and supporting financial institutions and market stakeholders to make finance work for positive change and achieve the SDGs. We now have over 12,000 global professionals engaging in our work and are supported by select core partners, of which I'm delighted to announce University of Edinburgh joining us today as a core partner as well. The task force is a fantastic opportunity to work with Scottish Government and Scottish financial enterprise and to bring together financial institutions across the markets here, including Aberdeen, NatWest Group, Baillie Gifford, and professional bodies, academic institutions, policy setters, and the City of London, amongst others, to drive practical action. The task force will be directed by its members and report into the First Minister through her Financial Services Growth and Development Board. GEFI is particularly keen to see the task force further three key agenda points. Firstly, capitalising and building on the momentum from COP26 that was hosted in Glasgow in November. For those of you who were here, I'm sure you enjoyed the lovely weather, and particularly the GFANZ initiative. I look forward to hearing more from Mark later on in this regard. Secondly, coordinating the financial services market to bring real benefits to our local communities by ensuring financial services is working with industry. And finally, reinvigorating Scotland's proud heritage in ethical finance and its tradition in having a strong intellectual culture of inquiry dating back to the Scottish Enlightenment, and indeed the debates that were held in New Hale's House in the late 1700s. We hope that using this legacy can inspire us by convening the best minds today, and we hope that Scotland's financial services sector can contribute to addressing local and global challenges in the green and sustainable finance arena. I now look forward to hearing from our esteemed speakers today, Mark Carney, Kate Forbes, Dame Susan Rice, John Glen, and David Pitt-Watson. Our sincere thanks to all of you, to all of our speakers and the team at Scottish Government and the task force members for making the time to support this initiative. And if I may, just a particular special thanks to David Pitt-Watson. David is a pioneer in responsible investments and former co-chair of UNEP-FI. He's an important member of GEFI's Global Steering Group, and I'm delighted that he's kindly made the time and agreed to take on the role as the task force chair. I have no doubt David's experience, output focus, and stewardship will be of immense help in making the task force successful. Thank you very much, David, and over to you.
Omar, thank you ever so much. I'm very honoured to be the task force chair. I was born and raised in Scotland, but also I've spent a very large part of my career just thinking about the issue of responsible investment. And, you know, 20, 30 years ago, it would be unimaginable that you could do a task force like this. I mean, I remember even 15 years ago, sitting in the basement at the United Nations, putting together the principles for responsible investment. There were 14 of us there. That's 15, 16 years ago. It's 2006. Today, there's over 4,000 members, investors, members, institutions, members of the Principles for Responsible Investment. They have over $100 trillion funds under management. Today, you know, it's investors that are pushing companies that they need to have climate plans, that they account properly, that they declare what it is that they're doing with the environment and on other social issues that are opposing lobbying. You know, 20 years ago, it would be unimaginable that the company that at the time I think was the biggest, most valuable company in the world would have its directors removed by shareholders because it wasn't addressing climate issues. Yet that is what happened last year to Exxon. When we went to the Paris conference, I led the UNEP Finance Initiative there. I think that year there were $20 billion of green bonds issued. Last year, it was $500 billion of green bonds. So there's lots and lots going on. And it's great that it's growing. And it hasn't just been one person that's done that. It's been financial institutions and regulators. It's been asset owners. It's been individuals. It's been campaigners. It's been service providers. It's been groups like GEFI as well. So I think that's a good thing. Indeed, I think it's critical if we're going to have a sustainable world that we have a sustainable financial system. But it's more than that. It's also a big opportunity. You know, markets work well when the organizations that deliver value prosper and succeed. This is a growing area. I think responsibly managed funds, according to Bloomberg, with whatever measure they used 3 years ago, 30 billion, in 3 years' time, more than 50 billion. Sorry, trillion, 30 trillion, 3 years' time, 50 trillion. So a huge area of growth. And it's one where Scotland actually has some considerable strength, even if it's not a recognised strength. I think Edinburgh came out as sort of 38th and Glasgow is 41st, a centre for sustainable investment. I don't think that's a fair representation of what it is that's going on in Scotland. But gosh, if Scotland could provide truly sustainable and green financial services, that would be a huge opportunity, not just for Scotland itself in providing finance to the country, but also in terms of how the Scottish financial service industry itself could benefit. So we're trying to do the right thing here, but we're trying to make sure that the Scottish financial services industry does well by doing the right thing. And look, we have a great lineup of speakers. The way this is going to work is I'm going to have three people present at the beginning: Kate Forbes, Mark Carney, John Glen. We'll then do a sort of a wee chat about some of the issues, and then finish with Susan Rice, and I'll speak for a couple of minutes at the end. But first, I'd like to introduce Kate Forbes, the Cabinet Secretary in Scotland for Finance and Economy. And I have to say, I found her an absolute breath of fresh air to work with. I've worked with sort of policymakers in finance over a number of years. Sadly, they're rarely women. Do you know there isn't a single Chancellor of the Exchequer in 300 years in the UK who's been a woman. There are rarely people who have been brought up internationally, not just in Scotland, but actually in India as well. There's certainly rarely people who were ever educated in Gaelic. But the most refreshing thing about Kate is that she's actually qualified to talk about finance. She's a qualified accountant. So, but let me therefore, Kate, hand over to you to talk a little bit about where Scotland sits in this and why the Scottish Government is interested in sponsoring this task force.
Well, thanks so much, David, not just for that warm welcome, but also for that inspiring vision, I think, behind the task force and those twin aims of the twin incentives here, the moral imperatives that underpin the task force, but also the immense economic opportunities. And I know, David, that you're ambitious for Scotland to be at the forefront of that. And a sincere thanks for your committed chairing of the task force and also for the work that you do as an ambassador for Scotland throughout your career, and now certainly in leading this global debate. It's an exciting time. This is a launch that I've been particularly excited about and looking forward to getting stuck in to the work of the task force. But thanks too to the GEFI team, because so often launches like this, which are public and high profile, come off the back of years, sometimes decades, but certainly years of hard work in small corners trying to get initiatives off the ground. And the GEFI team are certainly to be credited for bringing us to this point. Their work has placed Scotland at the very heart of the revolution, of the green, sustainable and ethical finance revolution. And we're certainly immensely proud that GEFI have chosen to make Scotland their home, because so many of their goals align with our ambitions, the Scottish Government's ambitions for our financial services industry and the wider economy. But certainly a very sincere welcome to everybody joining virtually today in Scotland. And it gives me great pleasure to highlight what our hopes and ambitions for this task force. And the task force mission is actually remarkably simple. It's to set out clearly, tangibly, what action Scotland's need to take to finance a just transition at home, and secondly, to build on our existing strengths as a leading European financial hub, to leverage that domestic leadership in pursuit of new, high growth, export-oriented jobs in a greener financial services industry. It doesn't need to be said, but we know the transition to a net zero economy will be a monumental undertaking. It's going to be the single greatest social and economic transformation required, perhaps in history, and it's going to impact every sector of the economy. No part of our economy, no part of our society will be immune to the impact of that transformation. And at its heart, it's going to require the reallocation of trillions of pounds of capital. And I said at the beginning, I'm ambitious for Scotland. I want to position Scotland as a place that helps solve the financial problems of the transition, a place which connects the dots, aligns values, vision, and the ability to deliver it. And I'm certainly convinced that although the task is monumental, it's achievable. Not just achievable because it needs to be done, but achievable if we look at the fact that so much of the resource, so much of the talent, so much of the commitment is here already. And we know how important finance is to prosperity and sustainability, and one of Scotland's fundamental economic strengths. One of our fundamental economic strengths for centuries has been our financial services industry. And I'm certainly lucky enough to see every day how this sector is a bedrock on which our economy is built. I want it to succeed nationally and internationally, not just because it's good for our economy, but because if we are to succeed when it comes to net zero, we need our financial services sector to succeed. To deliver the transition to net zero in the manner and the pace that we need, to do that, we need to harness the innovation, the creativity, and the skills of this industry, to work with governments, the regulatory community, business, to channel capital towards decarbonisation, towards adaptation, and towards resilience. And so the establishment of this task force does just that. It brings together leaders from industry, the regulatory community, government, academia, individuals who are eager to get involved and who recognise how big a need this is for all of humanity, but also, being clear, how big an opportunity it is for Scotland. And I think the launch of this task force certainly could not be better timed. And I'm delighted to be here at its public launch, because the decisions that this task force makes will have an impact over the coming years. And ultimately, its success will have a critical bearing on how we transition to a net zero carbon economy and whether we make the most of the opportunities ahead. We were obviously very proud that COP26 in Glasgow was one of perhaps the most significant conferences ever hosted by this country. And Scotland's COP26 saw more than 4,000 businesses commit to aligning their business models within that 1.5 degrees target and net zero emissions by 2050 by signing up to the UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign. And Mark, who I'm looking forward to hearing shortly, set out in Venice in summer 2021 that we won't get to net zero in a niche. Rather, virtually every company in every sector needs to transform its business model, requiring investments of over $100 trillion in the next 3 decades. And as Mark has previously articulated so well, if we get this right, we could turn an existential risk into the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. And I go back to my theme in my opening remarks. I'm ambitious for Scotland. If this is the greatest commercial opportunity of our time, off the back of COP26 allowing us to showcase and be the platform for these opportunities, I want to ensure that the Scottish financial services sector which for centuries has been at the bedrock of transformation, of revolution, is right at the heart of these opportunities. And GFANZ obviously was created to meet these needs, these global needs, bringing together over 250 financial institutions responsible for over $130 trillion of assets and anchored in the COP's race to zero. It's a roadmap for what the financial sector must do if we are to achieve sustainability. And here in Scotland, we want that task force to develop our route map that's complementary, that is anchored in GFANZ, but also recognises how Scotland can not just participate and contribute, but glean some of the opportunities and the benefits. This coalition of coalitions promising systematic, comprehensive, science-based, measurable, transparent and time-bound action bears the name of Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city. And our challenge now is to ensure that we live up to the promise of COP26, both in our domestic commitments and our global potential to make a difference. Like every politician, I can deliver the rhetoric and I can lay out my ambition, but it remains nothing but an ambition without tangible action. And that tangible action is where we need to focus our attention now. We need tangible action like launching Scotland's green investment portfolio, bringing together market-ready projects worth £3 billion this year, covering sectors from environmental, sustainable, commercial real estate to low-emission transportation and zero and green energy. But what's next? What are the tangible actions required to take to ensure that we're delivering on that ambition? GEFI's Path to COP26 programme set out clearly that nature is climate, climate is nature. We want to be at the frontier of deploying disclosure frameworks like the TCFD and in the development of initiatives like TNFD, which will both raise the risk profile and shift funding towards climate and nature positive economic activity. In Scotland, we're building the institutional foundations of a system that's able to seize the opportunities of transitioning to net zero. We know we need to mobilise our finances to fund that domestic transition. We know we need to meet it with projects and companies that can make use of the finances to drive the pace to net zero. So how do we do that? We need to encourage that drive, that aim, that goal to think bigger, better, fairer, greener, whilst providing the opportunity and headspace for companies to develop and share their innovative ideas. So what's my role? What's the role of government in all of this? Well, the role of government is to try and create certainty for investors. And to do that, we have to understand the world from their perspective, and the Taskforce will clearly help with that. It's clear to me that financial services and public, and more importantly, private investment have a vital role to play, not just on the journey to net zero and in helping to build greener, more resilient economies, but also in promoting a world where purposeful companies can pursue profit in a way which helps us to build a fairer, more sustainable world, one which is part of the solution to the problems we face. And certainly there's no end to the problems which face the world. Prosperity, fairness, global warming, human rights, diversity, and many other problems that are perhaps at top of our minds on a day like today. But ultimately, purposeful companies which help preserve the natural world that ultimately serves communities. And in a sense, the role of the finance industry is simple. It's to take money, our savings, and invest them where they're needed, where they can make a genuine return. And there's certainly never been a more important time to do that job well. So David, as I come to a close, in setting out certainly what my ambitions on behalf of the Scottish Government are, ambitions I know that are shared by members on the task force, as well as representatives of the financial services sector in Scotland. I want to close just by expressing my thanks to all members of the task force and to you, David, for chairing it, to GEFI, to Mark, John and Dame Susan, who have joined us today. We appreciate your commitment to this project and your commitment to Scotland. I know we share the same determination to strengthen Scotland's capabilities to mobilise and deploy capital on our domestic transition, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because we want to be at the heart, as we have so often been at the heart of previous revolutions and transformations. And the Taskforce leadership will help us both globally as well as help Scotland domestically to take a competitive position. And I certainly look forward to receiving the Taskforce's recommendations. I have no doubt they will be challenging and ambitious, but that's what we need. We need the tangible action that will meet the high ambitions we have set, not just for Scotland, not just for financial services, but indeed for the world to transition to net zero. Thanks very much, David.
Kate, thank you very much. And it's a great task force, 25, 30 different institutions and people. If you go on the website for the audience, you can see who's all involved in that. And hopefully to make a reality of that Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero. The architect of the GFANZ, of course, is our next speaker. Former governor of the Bank of England, former governor of the Bank of Canada as well, but somebody who, since stepping down and even before stepping down from the Bank of England, was very clear that we are facing a huge existential challenge with climate, but also mark a huge opportunity. And it's absolutely terrific to have you here at our launch, and interested to hear your thoughts about where finance needs to go over the coming years.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, David, for having me, Omar, for your chairmanship of GEFI. I'm thrilled to be joining this panel with my former colleague, Dame Susan Rice, one of the leaders in investing, ethical investing. One of the reasons I came to the Bank of England was Susan was on the court of the Bank of England and had helped lead the response, if you will, to the financial crisis. And Kate, after that, I know you're fully employed as cabinet secretary, but if you ever want to chair GFANZ, I'm happy to pass on the seat. I agreed with absolutely everything that you said. Now, David, you began your remarks with, you were reminiscing, rightly so, about the birth of the PRI and the amazing organization that the PRI is. When I was preparing for this, I was thinking back to just a little more than 2 years ago at a Burns Night celebration in Edinburgh Castle. And the First Minister, I had the honor of sitting next to the First Minister, Kate knows well, and we discussed how we could potentially channel the spirit of Adam Smith in COP26. And of course, it's Adam Smith of the Wealth of Nations who identified the invisible hand and how working through markets we can create prosperity. But also the Adam Smith of the theory of moral sentiments, who saw the dangers of divorcing economic capital from its social twin or separating profit from purpose. And really, that's been the genius of the long tradition in Scotland of ethical investing. And it's what was at the core of the success of Glasgow's COP26 by really developing that consensus for sustainability and helping to unleash the dynamism of the private sector to put value in service of values. If I go back to where we were 2 years ago, the proportion of emissions covered by country net zero targets was less than a third. It's now coming out of Glasgow almost 90%. As David, you referenced, net zero is now really becoming the organizing principle for over 5,000 of the world's largest companies. And with the right policies, those credible policies that Kate touched on, it will become the norm throughout not just the Scottish economy, but all of our economies. And our goal really was, as Kate alluded, to move out climate finance out of the niche and into the mainstream, and really build a financial system where every decision takes climate change into account. And it's a sophisticated audience here, so you know that there were a series of reforms away from the headlines that were delivered for COP26, 24 of them that helped transform the information, tools, and markets at the heart of finance. and that meant mandatory disclosure based on the TCFD, but moving really from the voluntary towards the mandatory through the International Sustainability Standards Board, that new board that's been set up and will deliver its first disclosure standard this summer. So talking about moving from aspiration to action, that is a core example. Secondly, widespread climate stress testing. For Glasgow, the group of central banks and supervisors that conduct this grew from the original 8 a few years ago to 100 central banks and supervisors covering virtually the entire global economy. We need best practice transition plans. I will come back to that, as well as frameworks to wind down stranded assets transparently and responsibly. So we had a series of these essential changes to the plumbing of the financial system, and we twinned that, as David and Kate kindly mentioned, with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, this alliance of alliances, which really has moved us from, again, if I go back to that Burns Night dinner 2 years ago, at that point, there was about $5 trillion of private financial assets that were committed to be managed to net zero, not just sustainability, but to net zero explicitly. And that figure is now over $130 trillion, or 40% of all global financial assets. In other words, financial firepower on the scale that's required. Now is the time to turn those commitments into implementation. And I'm going to concentrate the balance of my remarks on the 3 core work streams of GFANZ, which I think can help inform the task force priorities. They will be broader than this, but certainly I would include these near the heart. And the first is around, pardon me, implementing best practice, science-based net zero transition plans for companies and financial institutions. By COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, the first of those plans will come out for a number of banks and asset managers. And really, we need the input of leading financial institutions, including from Scotland, on what that should look like, and of governments, Kate, to then map those best practices into mandatory approaches, certainly for larger firms, but then cascading down through supply and value chains. Secondly, as I referenced a moment ago, we need comprehensive approaches to phase out or manage down stranded assets transparently, responsibly, and consistently with a just net zero transition. There's a lot of work that needs to be done as well in terms of aligning the core financial market indices and benchmarks with the transition in order to bring the power of passive capital to support that transition. And of course, the expertise in Scotland on asset management can be incredibly helpful in informing that important work. We do also have an opportunity, not least because of the success in Glasgow of finalizing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We have the opportunity to develop carbon offset markets that are complementary to the imperative of absolute emissions reductions. These offset markets will be particularly important in the global south and for indigenous groups, as well as developing nature-based solutions and making real some of the aspects. Kate referenced the TNFD, making real some of the aspects of nature-based solutions. Now, I think we all know that the net zero transition doesn't mean flipping a green switch. It would be fantastic if we were that simple. And it doesn't mean only investing in companies that themselves are already green. Financial institutions will have to go to where the emissions are and back those companies, including in heavy emitting sectors like steel and cement and agriculture and transportation, but backing those companies who have developed credible plans to transform their businesses for a net zero world. So the first core pillar is around this core elements of implementation net zero plans, both in the financial sector and in the real economy. The second will be briefer, but it is connecting and encouraging country net zero policies that will help unlock investment. There's a very synergistic approach between credible government policy and a financial sector that is oriented to net zero. The more credible and predictable government climate policies are, the more investors will pour money in anticipation, driving large-scale investment, faster decarbonization, more jobs, and greater growth. And to that end, in Glasgow, GFANZ released a call to action with concrete recommendations to governments for the types of deep decarbonization initiatives needed so that companies and countries can take full advantage of the progress in the financial sector. We'll continue to update those calls to action and stand ready to work with governments to flesh them out and develop them. The third pillar, and consistent with the long traditions in Scotland and the work of GEFI, is to work on mobilizing new investment into emerging and developing economies. We all know climate change is a global challenge. It won't be solved anywhere unless it's solved everywhere. We know that those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, in many cases, live in the global south. And we need enormous resources in order to fund the $1 trillion of additional annual investment needed for the net zero transition in emerging and developing economies by the middle of this decade. And that's just for the mitigation transition. Doesn't include adaptation, resilience, or loss and damage. We have a dedicated group at GFANZ working on this. We've already winnowed down from 80 existing initiatives that purport to mobilize private finance to the emerging and developing world and identify the 5 most promising to scale financial flows. We're looking and working with the G20 and COP presidencies to develop a new approach to country platforms that combine ambitious country climate plans, or NDCs, catalytic initiatives like the CFLI, GFANZ financing, and the expertise and capital of the multilateral development banks. So I should probably stop there so we have a chance for discussion after we hear from John Glen. But I'll just underscore that, as Kate emphasized, that the momentum in the financial sector that culminated in Glasgow and has been maintained since really does reflect a recognition that climate change isn't just a risk to be managed, although it is absolutely that, but it's also the biggest commercial opportunity of our time. And I'm very pleased, and I would encourage more of this, that Scottish financial institutions of all types to bring your skills, expertise, and yes, your capital to advance these efforts. Thank you.
Mark, thank you ever so much for that. I mean, a huge challenge, but a huge opportunity as well. And when we get into the discussion, I'll be really interested in, what are the key parts of that and how does that relate as well to a sort of the public sector and policy and all the rest of it. But before I do, John Glen, Economic Secretary to the Treasury, he can't be here personally for the discussion, but he has recorded a piece for us. So maybe if we could go to that now, and then we'll come back to Kate and Mark again.
Thank you all for being part of today's exciting launch event. And I'm sorry that I can't be with you live. I'm here at the Treasury campus in Darlington. But I'd like to offer my congratulations to GEFI and Scottish Financial Enterprise for what is a fantastic initiative. The first thing that I want to say is I'm delighted to see that Scotland is building on the legacy of COP26 and is eager to capitalise on the opportunities of financing that global shift to net zero. When I visited Glasgow again for Finance Day back in November, I was struck by how determined Scottish businesses were to lead the agenda. I was also very pleased to be able to attend the launch of the UK Islamic Finance Council's high-level working group on Green Sukuk at Loch Lomond. And I'm absolutely certain that that group will play a vital role in identifying and then harnessing the synergies between Islamic finance and the green finance agenda to mobilise green finance at a global scale. Now, we all know that Scottish economic life is massively enhanced by the presence of financial services, which contributes more than £9 billion to the Scottish economy in 2020 and employs around 80,000 people. And the transition to net zero offers what is already a buoyant and world-class financial services sector real opportunities, new opportunities that we must seize. Determined to lead by example, the government published the Greening Finance Roadmap ahead of COP26. And that set out in a very comprehensive plan what investors need in terms of the information to take climate into account for every financial decision. And we went that bit further on COP26 Finance Day, when the Chancellor announced our ambition to become the world's first net zero aligned financial centre. This means moving towards mandatory disclosures on transition planning for financial firms and publishing a sector-wide transition pathway. Scotland is essential to that. Scottish firms have a crucial role to play in tackling climate change and other environmental challenges. Everyone can contribute. Firms can support our shared ambition by making a commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and joining the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. Firms can publish transition plans to back up this commitment, as well as disclosures setting out your firm's approach to managing climate risk. Finally, asset managers and owners who play such a big role in Scottish financial services can integrate climate and the environment into their stewardship activities. None of us can get this done alone. It really will be a collaborative effort across the whole of the United Kingdom, which is why this is an important day and a very encouraging initiative, and why I'm looking forward to seeing how the Scottish Taskforce for Green and Sustainable Financial Services helps the UK become the world's first net zero aligned financial centre, something that we can all have a hand in and something that we can all be very proud of. Thank you.
So look, some terrific support there for what it is that we want to do with a task force. And I should say I've been being a bad chair. I've overrun a little bit, and I think we may overrun this call to an hour and 5 minutes, but I'll try and catch up a little bit in the discussion. But one question, it seems to me, that arises from this, and if I can start with you, Mark. I mean, what is the role of the finance sector? What is the role of the public sector? What is the role of the consumer? What should we be asking of the finance sector? Because it can't do everything on its own, but at the same time, we can't get there unless we've got the finance industry harnessed. So which particular bits would you say we need to be looking at it, focusing on?
Say anything, because I'm on mute now, I will say something, which is that I mean, all of those that you identified are important. And look, it ultimately starts with, if I say the consumer, but really people. People set the objectives, and they've made clear that they want sustainability, and none more so than the people of Scotland. And, you know, it's the responsibility of the financial sector to enable the types of investments that are needed to get us from where we are to where people want us to be. And, you know, there's lots of lessons from the pandemic, but one of them is we can't shrink our way to net zero. You know, we shut down a quarter of our economy for good reason, for health reasons, and emissions only fell by 7%, not enough. And we have to do that year in, year out to be on a track for net zero. So we need large scale investment, and we need the financial sector oriented and looking forward to the pathways that are necessary. And that's why all those seemingly arcane, you and I love them, David, but I think Susan's quite fond of them as well, actually. But these arcane things like accounting rules and plumbing and indices and other aspects, we need all of that so that the financial sector has the information and the tools in some of these new markets to have that forward look to the pathway to net zero. But then what we need from governments is we need two things. We need some of the things that John Glen just talked about, which is to take those initiatives of the financial sector, private sector, and make them into rules and regulation, formal rules and regulations on accounting as example, disclosure, as he said. But then we need, the broader policy suite that Kate was talking about and governments bring. And I'll give an example and I'll stop on this one, which is it is very useful for consumers and financiers and ultimately business to know that you can't sell a new internal combustion vehicle in Scotland and the UK after 2030. That's far enough in the future that you can do something about it, but near enough that you have to. And that's what drives the investment in reworking and will get us to a position we have low emission vehicles increasingly on the streets of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and up and down the country. So it's all interlinked. Finance can do a lot. It can't do it all, but it should be out in front. And that's, I think, what we have coming out of COP26 in Glasgow.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark. And this, frequently I would be one of the people in the finance system complain about sort of excessive regulation, because often there is a huge amount of regulation, but actually without a clarity of what the rules are and where it is that we're headed, the world becomes very, very different difficult for finance. And the tragedy of the horizon is sort of doubled, isn't it? Because you don't really know where the world's going to be in 10 years. And then, Kate, it seems to me that this whole thing therefore becomes a big ecosystem of industry, government, finance, but it's also politically quite tricky because, for example, it's all very well to say, well, we want a transition, but we need a fair transition, a just transition. And therefore, there's a huge amount of sort of political judgment on how it is that we move all this forward in the right direction. It's not easy.
Far from easy, and for those of us who have to face down our constituents every 5 years at an election, we know just how difficult it is. I mean, Mark sets out such a compelling vision, though, not just of the commercial opportunity, but how we do it. So this notion of not being able to just shut down or shrink parts of the economy, it's about growth and development in the right areas. And I think that's where we see the opportunities for Scotland. So we know already that it's in, say, Scotland-based investment funds are managing significantly higher percentages of the UK's responsible investing market compared with the share of the conventional market, and that has formed a significant part of the sector's strong growth in recent decades. So there's an example of precisely what Mark's talking about. Here's an opportunity for growth. And from a Scottish perspective, our financial services is a bedrock. So if financial services is doing well, then the Scottish economy is doing well, and we are well placed. The next thing I would just identify is that we are making great strides. You talked about an ecosystem of opportunity. We're making great strides. Since, David, we last spoke, certainly, we announced the world's largest floating offshore wind. ScotWind is the world's largest commercial round for floating offshore wind. Now, is Scottish Financial Services, they are at the table to ensure that the £25 billion of investment that's been promised, £1 billion for every gigawatt of energy generated, is it going to be Scotland's financial services is going to benefit from the financing of that, or is it going to be somebody else? So where there are significant economic opportunities, are they matched by the financing opportunities as well? So those would just be two very brief points, and I'll keep it brief because I definitely was the reason you overran on the timetable. So back to you, David.
It was well worth it. But no, I mean, I think that's there's a symbiosis here, isn't there? And there are other agents involved. I mean, I'd be interested, Kate, in terms of from a Scottish perspective, or no, let me start with you, Mark, from a global perspective. I mean, do you think we're on a track, or do you, I mean, is this something that you feel optimistic that we're getting there? Or is this something where you think there's just too much blah, blah, blah in this and not enough real action?
I think we're on. No, I think we're on a track. I wouldn't take anything for granted, and I'd recognize absolutely, as everyone on this panel, part of the urgency is we left it very late. But we're on the track. One of the things that prevents this from being, to pick up on your question, blah blah blah, is that at least with respect to addressing climate change, to getting to net zero. The advantage is these are hard numbers. You either have emissions or you don't. They're either going up, sideways, or down. They need to go down. We're setting up a system where all financial institutions are going to be reporting annually the emissions, not just of their operations, that's the easy bit, but the emissions of all their clients, all their investments, all their loans. And that will show the dynamics. So there's kind of nowhere to hide in this. Financial institutions, particularly Scottish financial institutions, are very good at managing numbers. It's one of the strengths. They know how to. People in Scotland know how to count. It's one of the strengths. And we will be counting emissions. Now, last point, and I'll finish on this, which is that what's critical, though, and this is the part of what we're building, is that the judgment about those pathways of emissions is it depends on the different sectors. If I'm going to go and lend to the steel sector, emissions are high in the steel sector, but it may be the right thing to do because they're investing in electric arc furnaces, or they're investing in renewable power that's coming into the steel sector to get those emissions down. And so it's putting money to work where the emissions are to get them down, because ultimately that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and it's tricky, isn't it? This needs to be something that I mean, you need to know these measures, but you need them in good faith, because I mean, in Scotland, for example, an oil industry that I guess has a limited life until we've got carbon capture and storage and so on, but you wouldn't want to close it today, so you have all that just transition stuff. A Kate, that needs to be managed, but with a clarity of where we need to get to by 2050, which is, as Mark says, needs to be measured and needs to be net zero.
Absolutely, and defining just transition, what is it we mean? It means not leaving communities behind. That's perhaps self-explanatory. It's about creating new work. But there's another side of this too, which is that in the pursuit of ethical financing, we're not at the same time removing communities or people's agency. And that for me is a particularly pressing issue in terms of our resources. I said in my opening comments that ultimately, if you break down the complexities of financing, it's about our money that's being invested for the greater good of our world. And that greater good starts with the communities on our doorsteps in every country around the world. And I guess in my first answer, I was saying we need to be clear with the public about what we're trying to do. And then secondly, we need to be clear what the parameters are. And that's why we talk a lot about collaborating with investors that share our values. It's growth with a purpose, not growth at all costs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that feels right, doesn't it? I mean, it's 2/3 of household financial assets in the UK are pensions. Just crazy to be investing pensions for the short term, and they belong to millions upon millions of people. How does the finance industry represent that? Because politicians can set and have to set some important frameworks about reporting and internal combustion engines and all of those sorts of things. But in the end of the day, if the finance industry decides that it's going to work to rule rather than work to principle on this and not open up to those communities, that causes a problem. I don't know, Mark, I'd be interested in your experience in, at the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. How do we get the finance system so that it's embracing these challenges? I mean, you've been terrific about, talking about every decision you take has to take climate and I guess other things into account. But it's ever so difficult. It's ever so easy, isn't it, for the finance industry to decide, no, I'll just do it by the highest net present value, and that's the only calculation I think about.
Yeah, it's look, there are certain things you can do to embed this into the processes of financial institutions. I'll give an example we haven't talked about, which is climate stress testing. And for those who don't follow it, what the regulator basically says to a bank, it could be the Royal Bank of Scotland, the question is, well, what if we succeed? What if we succeed in getting on the path to 1.5 degrees, and there's the right consumer decisions and government regulation and carbon prices? Where do you have losses and exposure? Which of your clients, your lenders, are ready, which aren't, and what does your balance sheet look like in that case? And that's a question that Susan, former board member, and I think would say, well, I want to know the answer to that question. I want to know my senior management knows the answer to the question, has the ability to get that question. So that starts to drill into the management of the bank. Okay, I have to look at the world from that lens, at least one of the lenses. But it doesn't, to your question, David, necessarily mean that when the moment comes for the loan that they necessarily take that in. So you can lead the horse to water, the banking horse to water, if you will. But there has to be this broader sense of two things. One is that society, government regulation is going to get there in the end. So it may take a little longer, but eventually that carbon price, that regulation, that consumer behavior will come there. So I might as well be a bit ready for it. Or it requires the sort of core commitment to the underlying values, which is, you can't legislate, you can't regulate it. It has to be there, and it has to be consistent with where people are going. I think the critical point is that we're at a position coming out of Glasgow where we have a financial sector that's oriented to net zero. It's going to have the information and the tools. And you have this opportunity for this huge positive reinforcement from government policy, from consumer behavior, back through finance, who will then be looking for opportunities to get those emissions down. And that's the opportunity we need to seize.
Yeah. So we're trying to get this virtuous circle, and one that people buy into the creation of that virtuous circle. I mean, I am quite struck. We were looking through the members of the task force and how many of them are signed up to the GFANZ mark, and certainly all the big ones are. And since that's most of the Scottish finance industry, it feels like there is a real desire to do the right thing here. I don't know, Kate, if that's what you feel when you talk to the Scottish financial institutions.
I think that's a very fair characterization, David, that by and large, our establishment of the task force isn't just a political desire. It's actually a reflection of what industry are saying to us. And Omar said at the beginning that the task force will report to essentially the financial services board that we have in Scotland with representatives from across industry, because that's what they want. Now, our job, I think, is to facilitate that, make that as easy as possible, because the benefits are enormous. Just briefly touching on your last question about the challenges ahead. Net zero is easy to talk about. It's really difficult to deliver. Net zero by 2045, the monumental change that's required. And the financial industry, perhaps of all industries, is in a position to facilitate major change by moving money to sustainable investments. So they're at the table, they want to do it. It's now up to, I think, regulators and others and government to provide clear vision to help get there.
Yeah, and get some consensus about how we do this, and maybe that's doable in Scotland in a way that it's difficult to do in some enormous financial centre like London. I should say, I am struck by, my kids always tease me about how I always go on about everything being invented in Scotland, but actually the first savings bank was Scottish. The first actuarially sound pension fund was Scottish. The first investment trust was Scottish. Even the bloke who did the plan for the setting up of the Bank of England. He had a pretty murky past otherwise, but he was Scottish. And when you look at what's happening in ethical investment in Scotland, it's disproportionate to what is happening in the rest of the UK, and feels like there has to be something that we're able to build on there. But look, Mark and Kate, we could go on for a long time, but I know I need to finish this in 5 or 10 minutes time. So let me hand over at this. Thank you both very much, and hand over at this stage to Susan Rice. Susan.
David, thank you very much. And I'm sure you heard, as I did at COP26, that the conversation has well and truly shifted from ideas to pragmatic solutions, to getting on with it. And we've just heard that from the panel. I thought it was a terrific conversation. So thanks to you, Mark and Kate, and of course, David. And Mark, I'll just remind you that there was no heat in the castle that January night. You'll remember that as well. You still spoke compellingly. But just now, you've all set out ways to achieve net zero globally, and the Scottish Government's role and ambition within that process. You've shared a lot about the what we can do, what needs to be done, what areas should see our ambition rise higher and sooner to create the momentum and ultimate success that we must have. So I want to shift for a few minutes from the what to the how, and maybe finish up with a few words about the why. I do this because initiating effective change, raising ambition, having broad impact depends not just on goals and the wherewithal to achieve them, but also on the way that organizations and the people in them work. And that's what I mean by the how. I've had experience across many parts of the financial services sector. I ran a clearing bank, sat on the court of the Bank of England in Mark's early days, chair now an investment trust, sat on the board of a private bank, helped create a bank assurance business, and have helped build a number of organizations in the sphere of impact finance, supported the Chartered Banker Institute in creating professional standards for bankers for the first time anywhere. And I currently chair the Financial Services Culture Board. In every one of these very different contexts, it's been clear that however good the strategy and however abundant or not the resources, it's people at the end of the day who make the business happen. And their success derives from the culture of the organization. Financial services, of course, needs regulation. We have a lot of that. But if we want our people to follow the spirit and not just the letter of the law, then our organizations need a culture where people at all levels make judgments and take decisions that start with the customer and wider society. A culture where people feel they should be doing the right thing, and one where they'll be recognized and rewarded for doing so. I think it's essential, therefore, to embed the drive to reduce emissions into the core of every financial organization so that it informs how all employees go about their work. COP26 saw financial institutions queuing up to make bold commitments, but unless these are accompanied by adaptation within their organizations, we risk employees identifying the commitments as talk or greenwashing, or as not their responsibility, but belonging to someone else. And that's just not good enough. Firms might set out a strategic framework, such as supporting customers and supply chain partners in their transition to lower carbon emissions, setting ambitious targets to achieve net zero themselves, developing the tools for clear and measurable sight of progress, recognizing what needs to be done along the way to net zero, and making regular and transparent disclosures to communicate progress, for instance, in line with the guidance set out by the Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. Indeed, one would hope every financial institution would do something like that, but even that's not enough on its own because it risks becoming a box-ticking exercise, which is certainly not good enough. Being a net zero financial institution requires a commitment to reducing carbon with engagement from the top down and from the bottom up. A G30 report a couple of years ago spoke to the tone from the top and the echo from the bottom, and I've just found that a wonderful trope. That's all about culture, and both the top down and the bottom up are needed, especially when an organization is moving into uncharted territory. With an appropriate culture in place, firms are more likely to take considered risk because everyone in the organization has responsibility, more likely to go further to refine and develop what they see as possible, more likely to factor in future and not just immediate value, all of which are so important in the net zero transition. Yet that can be made more difficult because of asymmetry of information, because relevant internal analytic capability hasn't yet developed because there's a lack of clarity about what technologies and what ways of operating will rise to the top in the future. So it's hard to know where to place your bet. Financial services organizations can learn and move more quickly if they do it within a context where different players work together, where firms learn from each other, where collaboration helps get finance out there appropriately and quickly. And that's why with this new task force, we've built a coalition of financial services players ready to work together in Scotland to help achieve net zero. Going back to my question about how, in addition to the internal culture, it's about collaboration, about coalitions, about working together to learn more quickly what works financially. But what gives Scotland the temerity to launch this task force aiming to be a world-leading centre for green and ethical finance? And why us? Well, there's some very good reasons. We can be bold in this way because Scotland has a significant number and a breadth of financial services organizations and expertise, disproportionately so for its size. And actually, we can do this in Scotland because of our size, because so many people in business and government and diverse organizations know each other and readily talk to each other. And because even with a national temperament of ostensible modesty, there's deep-rooted pride, which you just heard from David, in the notable international impact Scotland has had on financial services for more than 3 centuries. Over that time, its specific approaches to banking, to insurance, to risk, to audit, to financial education have been picked up and adopted by countries around the world. Why not also with net zero? Several years ago, the Chartered Banker Institute, based in Scotland, launched the world's first benchmark green and sustainable finance certificate. And that's another reason. We're not just starting out today with the launch of this task force. This is a country which has been on the front foot in relation to net zero, setting more aggressive targets for the reduction of greenhouse emissions than others. We have businesses like Scottish Water with its pioneering work on creating heat from wastewater, and universities such as Edinburgh appointing the world's first professor of carbon capture and storage and leading the development of technologies to reduce carbon. They all do this by working collaboratively. Our COP26 legacy presents a unique opportunity at the national level for our financial services sector also to work together and demonstrate global leadership in implementing the GFANZ roadmaps. Get this right, and Scotland has a chance to achieve Kate's vision of being a globally recognized centre for green and sustainable financial services, and maybe there'll be some more heat in the castle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Look, let me just say a couple of minutes in conclusion and sort of reflect a little bit on what we said. I mean, I think there's a consensus that in Scotland and the UK, everywhere, we need to do this. We need to have a sustainable financial system. And I think also that this isn't in any one person's gift. It's not in any one person's gift in the finance system. And the finance system can't do it on its own. It needs to be with the public sector and others as well. I think, Susan, as well, your point about this is about people. That people within the finance system need to be wanting to do this, not just a trusted finance system, but a trustworthy financial system that's delivering this. Mark, your point as well, we're not at the beginning of this journey. This is particularly under your leadership in the past couple of years. We've been making big strides here. Let's try and make sure that we're harnessing that. And it is already happening in Scotland. As Kate mentioned, more ESG managed assets in Scotland than in the rest of the UK, but yet Edinburgh and Glasgow still 38th and 41st. I hope that will be one thing that will change as a result of us getting together with this a task force. And we won't do it again on our own. It won't just be Scottish institutions. It will be harnessing, as we heard from John Glen, the support of the UK government, that the UK becomes a centre of green and a sustainable finance. I wonder as well whether we should be thinking in Scotland about joining the Financial Centres for Sustainability initiative, which is a UN initiative, because I think we'd have stuff to learn, and I think perhaps the other countries would have stuff to learn for Scotland. I'm sure there will be areas which will emerge where Scotland as well will have a clear competitive advantage in what it is that it's doing. I'm sure there will be areas that will emerge where there is clearly need for finance in Scotland. And I hope that just as a task force, we have no executive authority at all, but I hope that as a task force that we can help build a roadmap, a clear roadmap for change. And in the end, I guess that means that in our hour and 10 minutes, we're not just here to lecture you, we're actually here to recruit you and have you think about what is it that you can contribute to what it is that we are trying to do here. And I hope that those of you who are listening, who are involved and who are interested will feel that you can contribute. Please go on the website, please send messages through the secretariat. And I personally think we've gone a very long way. I think we still have a very, very long way still to go. But I'm always reminded of that great quote from Margaret Mead, that you should never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Well, that small group is becoming a bigger group. We need to change the trajectory of the world, and we can do some of that within the finance industry. I hope this task force can help lay out a roadmap for that. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank Kate Forbes and her team, Linda Anderson and others. I'd like to thank Mark for everything that he's done and will be doing. Susan, for your contribution through all the roles that you've played, but perhaps particularly in banking standards and culture and those sorts of things. And of course, your chairing of the steering group at GEFI. Omar, thanks to you, thanks to Chris and the other people at GEFI who have made this possible. Thanks to the 30 and plus participants in the task force. And thanks finally to everybody who has been on this call. I hope you found it stimulating. I hope you found it interesting. And I hope that we'll be hearing from you over the next couple of years. And with that, thank you very much. And I'll bring this to a close. Thank you.